All forms of addiction are bad, no matter whether it's drugs, alcohol, or idealism. Did you know that addiction is not just about substances, but an attempt to fill an emotional void? At certain times, some behaviors seem inevitable, almost like a refuge in the midst of chaos. It all begins discreetly, usually as an attempt to relieve constant discomfort or fill a void. Over time, these actions become habits, and what was supposed to be a momentary solution ends up becoming a cycle that is difficult to break. The search for quick relief and a fleeting feeling of tranquility ends up evolving into a routine that gradually becomes destructive. But what really feeds this cycle? What drives someone to repeatedly pursue something they know is harmful? The truth is that these behaviors are often reflections of a deeper wound. They are efforts to fill a void that seems unbearable. It's not just about pleasure or immediate relief, but about the need to find something that's missing. Although at first glance it may seem like self-destruction, deep down it is a silent search for meaning, an attempt to relieve an invisible pain that is beyond conscious control. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to get lost in addictions, as if there were no way out, while others manage to escape these traps? Addiction is one of the most intricate and enigmatic challenges facing the human mind. It manifests itself in various ways in our society, from substance abuse to compulsive behaviors that often reflect a deep existential emptiness. What really drives this almost uncontrollable need to escape from reality? Is it simply a question of a lack of willpower, or is there something deeper, something that goes unnoticed by most of us? In this video, we'll delve into the topic of addiction from the perspective of Carl Jung and physician and author Dr. Gabor Mate. We'll investigate how addiction arises, why it can become such a difficult cycle to break, and what lies behind these behaviors. We will discover that addictions are not just responses to external influences, but reflections of unresolved internal conflicts. The aim is to look beyond the behavior itself and understand addiction as a symptom of something deeper, offering a new vision of this very human challenge. For Carl Jung, addiction is not simply a matter of moral weakness or character flaws, but a manifestation of deep imbalances in the human psyche. Jung saw addictions as forms of escape, attempts to relieve psychological suffering, or fill an existential void. When someone is unable to face their inner conflicts, they may end up seeking refuge in addictive behaviors that offer only temporary relief from deeper pain. According to Jung, the psyche is a totality, made up of a complex interaction between conscious and unconscious aspects. When addiction arises, it often reflects an unconscious effort to fill an inner void. This void can be caused by various factors, such as a lack of purpose, emotional disconnection, or the denial of parts of one's personality that have been repressed or ignored. For Jung, addiction also represents an escape from reality. During periods of anguish, stress, or existential crisis, the person may resort to substances or compulsive behaviors as an attempt to protect themselves from the pressures of the outside world. However, this escape is always temporary, and the return to reality tends to be even more painful. Thus, a destructive cycle is formed. Addiction not only fails to solve the original problem, but often intensifies it. Gabor Mate, in his book The Kingdom of Hungry Ghosts, writes, "False needs, no matter how many times they are satisfied, cannot leave us truly satisfied. The brain can never, so to speak, feel that it has had enough, that it can relax and get on with other essential matters. It's as if, after a full meal, you're still hungry and have to immediately reach for more food." For Mate, addiction is defined as any repetitive behavior, whether involving substances or not, in which the person feels a compulsion to continue, even though they are aware of the harm it does to themselves and others. When we think of addiction, we often associate it with the use of chemical substances, but behavioral addictions are just as prevalent and can be just as destructive. Excessive use of social networks, pornography, video games, gambling, sex, shopping, or even apparently healthy activities such as physical exercise or work can turn into addictions, depending on the relationship the person establishes with these practices. Mady points out that any passion has the potential to turn into an addiction. The central question is, who is in control, you or the behavior? While a passion can be dominated, an addiction, by definition, dominates the person. To differentiate between them, just ask yourself, given the negative impact it has on me and others, would I be willing to stop? If the answer is no, you're probably dealing with an addiction. And if you try to stop but can't keep your promise, this further confirms the addiction. The debate about the origin of addictions is extensive. While some believe that the problem lies with the individual, a broader view sees addiction as the result of the interaction between the person and the object of addiction. It arises when the individual repeatedly seeks to alter their emotional state or their perception of themselves, becoming dependent on something external, be it a substance or an activity, to achieve this desired change. In Addiction by Design, Natasha Dow-Schull points out that just as some people are more vulnerable to addiction, certain objects or activities have characteristics that make them more likely to trigger or intensify this behavior. Whether due to their chemical or structural properties, these objects have the ability to create such intense subjective changes that some people end up depending on them. In essence, the potency of an addictive object is directly linked to its ability to provoke internal transformations that seem irresistible. Living in a world full of objects and activities with the potential to cause addiction, in this video, we're going to focus on the human side of this equation. We'll explore why some people are more susceptible to addiction than others. According to Gabor Mate, who has dedicated his career to working with addicted people, all addiction, whether substance-related or behavioral, is ultimately an attempt to relieve suffering and emotional pain. For Mate, addiction is much more than a search for pleasure. It is a desperate effort to escape pain, whether it is overt or hidden in the unconscious. The sources of this emotional pain are varied. Some people turn to addiction to deal with depression, anxiety, or insecurities. Others cope with the stress caused by toxic jobs or relationships. There are also those who seek to avoid the existential emptiness, sense of purposelessness or hopelessness that accompanies a disconnected life. Mate tells the story of a 47-year-old man who had been addicted to drugs since he was a teenager. When asked why he continued to use drugs, he replied, "I don't know. I'm just trying to fill a void in my life, a boredom, simply a lack of direction." This sentence encapsulates the crux of the matter. Addiction is often an attempt to fill emotional and existential gaps. In many cases, this emotional pain has its roots in the past, especially in childhood. Studies show that a large proportion of heavy drug users grew up in abusive or neglectful homes. As Carl Jung observed, all parental difficulties inevitably leave their mark on the child's psyche, sometimes with pathological consequences. These unresolved emotional scars can manifest themselves throughout life, driving addictive behaviors as an attempt to heal a pain that is often invisible but deeply rooted. The influence of parents on a child's development and their vulnerability to addiction in adult life is profound and undeniable. Just as a baby, still in the womb, is completely dependent on the mother's body, in the first years of life, the child's brain, which is extremely malleable, remains emotionally and psychologically intertwined with the parents. When childhood is marked by pain, anger, or abuse, emotional suffering not only lurks in the child's mind, but also alters brain development in significant ways. This dysfunctional environment can compromise critical areas of the brain, such as the dopamine and opioid systems, which are responsible for pleasure, the limbic brain, which regulates emotions, the stress system, and even the areas of the cortex involved in impulse control. As Gabor Mate points out, many addicts report using substances as a way of relieving their emotional pain, but the roots go beyond that. The healthy development of their brains has been sabotaged by traumatic childhood experiences. It's not just visible traumas that leave their mark. Children raised by emotionally cold or distant caregivers are also more prone to addiction in adulthood. Psychologist Alan Shore refers to this as the parental emotional absence of close separation. In this scenario, parents may be physically present, providing for all the child's material and basic needs, but due to stress, depression, or internal emotional issues, they fail to offer the necessary emotional support. Gabor Mate notes that a child can experience emotional distress even when the parent is physically close but psychologically absent. Naturally, the child tries to reestablish the emotional connection with the parent. However, if they don't receive a response or if this response is inadequate, the child develops precarious coping mechanisms, such as sucking their thumb or rocking their body to calm themselves down. In more extreme cases, they may disconnect emotionally as a way of escaping the anguish. These seemingly simple responses can turn into a lifelong search for external satisfaction, often in the form of substances or addictive behaviors. Interestingly, not even those who had emotionally healthy childhoods are completely immune to addiction. In a broader context, cultural and social factors also play an important role. Just as in the fall of Rome, when many people sought refuge in pleasures to relieve the despair generated by a society in decline. Today, we live in a scenario where the gloomy outlook on the future of the world leads many to seek relief in addictions. Whether to deal with hopelessness, social pressure, or existential emptiness, addictions have become a modern form of self-medication. In addition, to fit in with the modern world, we are pressured to embrace consumerism as a lifestyle, compulsively using technology, social media, and entertainment as ways to escape feelings of powerlessness and emptiness. This creates a perfect storm that fuels the current addiction crisis. Gabor Mate writes, "A deficient sense of emptiness pervades our entire culture. The addict is more painfully aware of this emptiness than most people. Many of us resemble addicts in our ineffectual efforts to fill the spiritual black hole at the center, where we have lost touch with our souls and our spirits, with those sources of meaning and value that are neither contingent nor ephemeral." The consumer culture we live in, with its obsession with acquisition, productivity, and appearance, not only fails to fill this void, but often deepens it, leaving us even more disconnected and dissatisfied. When we add this to the large number of people who have grown up in abusive or emotionally absent homes, as well as the crumbling state of many social structures, it's not surprising that so many people seek refuge in drugs or behavioral addictions as a way of coping with life. And as destructive as this may seem, it's neither completely irrational nor ineffective. At least in the short term, addictions offer temporary relief from emotional pain and suffering. As Gabor Mate points out, one drug addict described the reason for his use clearly. "It's so I don't feel the feelings I feel when I don't take drugs." This phrase sums up the function that addictions perform, numbing emotional pain and creating an escape, albeit momentary, from an emptiness that seems unbearable. Addictions not only relieve suffering and emotional pain, they can also temporarily lift someone out of the monotony or misery of everyday life, providing moments of emotion, meaning, and even joy. This feeling of uplift, albeit momentary, may be one of the reasons why so many end up trapped in these behaviors. The psychologist William James, at the beginning of the 20th century, analyzed the effects of alcohol and pointed out that it not only relieves tension, but can also induce a state comparable to a spiritual experience, at least until its harmful effects begin to manifest themselves. In the Varieties of Religious Experience, James wrote, "The dominion of alcohol over mankind is undoubtedly due to the deeper mystery and tragedy of life, that the shards and glimpses of something we immediately recognize as excellent are granted to many of us only in the early and fleeting stages of what is, in totality, such a degrading poisoning." This illustrates how addictions can initially seem almost transformative until the inevitable damage takes hold. However, while addictions work in the short term, they take a heavy toll over time. Shortcuts to emotional relief and happiness come at a cost. The more we rely on an addiction, the greater our tolerance becomes, and the more we depend on the substance or activity to feel any form of pleasure or positive emotion. Slowly, the addiction takes control of our lives, while everything that could offer genuine and lasting satisfaction, health, relationships, creativity, career, and purpose, falls by the wayside. In addition, addictions cause changes in brain structure that weaken our ability to control and make decisions. When we are trapped in an addiction, we often enter a state of brain lock, in which we follow automatic impulses while a part of us watches helplessly. It's as if we know we're self-destructing but can't act to stop the process. Thus, the vicious cycle consumes not only our mind and body, but also our potential and the possibility of a more meaningful life. Given the strong hold that addiction exerts, the essential question arises, is it possible to overcome it? The great challenge in the quest for a renewed, addiction-free life is that the very mechanism needed to heal the brain is one that has been damaged by addiction. As Gabor Mate warns, the more intense the addiction, the greater the brain abnormality, and the greater the biological obstacles to achieving health. However, there is hope. The human brain is incredibly resilient. Even at advanced ages, it has the capacity to restructure itself and create new connections, enabling a person to live, perhaps for the first time, a full, healthy, and addiction-free life. This brings us to the concept of nodal consciousness. This form of awareness is powerful because it allows the cycle of addiction to be broken. Instead of getting stuck in the polarities of pleasure and pain, desire and satisfaction, nodal awareness helps the individual to embrace the whole spectrum of human experiences with equanimity. For Carl Jung, this process of overcoming begins with awareness. Without the ability to look inwards and identify their own internal mechanisms, a person is doomed to repeat the same behaviors without ever understanding the source of their problems. Awareness, then, is the first fundamental step towards transformation. It is through this that the individual can realize that addiction is not the root of the problem, but a temporary escape from real psychological suffering. The first and most crucial step in overcoming addiction is to recognize it and understand the impact it has on one's life. Although this may sound simple, many people spend years trapped in the cycle of denial, without questioning the deep-seated motives that lead them to seek relief in harmful behaviors. When the person finally accepts that the addiction is a temporary solution to a greater pain, they make room to begin the healing process. From that moment on, it is necessary to reflect deeply on the aspects of your life that led you to addiction. This reflection not only helps to understand the roots of the problem, but also allows the individual to begin a journey of self-knowledge and true transformation. Reflection is a crucial stage in the process of overcoming addiction, because without it, it is impossible to understand the deeper roots of addictive behaviors. As Jung described, the human psyche is made up of layers of complexes, symbols, and internal conflicts that often remain hidden until the individual is willing to look inside themselves. For Jung, addiction is more than a habit or destructive behavior. It is a symbolic manifestation of the pains and shadows hidden in the psyche. It is an unconscious attempt to deal with internal suffering, a way for the mind to seek balance in the midst of emotional chaos. When a person begins to reflect on their addiction, they begin a journey of self-discovery that Jung called individuation. Individuation, a central concept in Jungian psychology, is the process of integrating all aspects of the psyche, both light and dark, into a harmonious whole. This requires the courage to face repressed aspects and shadows without judging them, but with the intention of learning from them. Although this path of self-knowledge can be painful, it is also essential for true freedom. In the context of addiction, reflection helps to identify the emotional and mental patterns that sustain the behavior. For example, an alcoholic may realize that drinking alcohol has become a way of numbing feelings of loneliness or coping with a lack of purpose. In this sense, the addiction goes beyond the substance or behavior itself. It represents a defense mechanism against deeper suffering. By recognizing this, the individual can begin to seek healthier ways of dealing with their emotions and replace addiction with practices that nourish the mind and spirit. Deep down, almost every action we take is an attempt to solve the problem of the self, the search for meaning, security, or relief. Addiction, in turn, is an extreme manifestation of this attempt, creating neurological trails so deep in the brain that the behavior becomes automatic, as if it were inescapable. Over time, these trails reinforce the feeling of powerlessness and imprisonment. Both Jung and the concepts of non-duality approach addiction in a similar way. The solution lies not in fighting addiction, but in transcending the ego and the pain associated with the separate self. This transcendence involves recognizing that individual identity and the pain associated with it are not all we are. When the individual learns to welcome the totality of their experience without clinging to pleasure or running away from pain, they begin to break out of compulsive patterns and find freedom in a more authentic and connected life. However, there is a fundamental distinction. Jung approaches the problem of the I by seeking the integration of the different aspects of the psyche, a process he called connection with the archetypes of the self. When this integration occurs, the I is no longer in conflict with itself, allowing the person to experience a sense of self-transcending wholeness. This state not only promotes inner balance, but also initiates a spiritual awakening and a profound transformation in consciousness. This change in consciousness is so significant that it has a direct impact on addictive behavior patterns. One of the biggest misconceptions when dealing with addiction is to see it as purely a question of a lack of willpower. In fact, addiction is almost the opposite of this. It reflects the internal struggle of someone who needs to transcend a problem that is bigger than their own personal ability to solve. This doesn't mean exempting individual responsibility, but rather recognizing that overcoming addiction requires accessing a power that goes beyond willpower, something that transcends the ego and personal limitations. Although the path to overcoming addiction is deeply inward, Jung also recognized the importance of social support in the healing process. He believed that the human being is essentially a social being, and that the psyche is shaped and influenced by relationships with others. This means that although addiction is often rooted in internal conflicts, it is also closely linked to social and cultural dynamics. Healing, therefore, is not just an individual journey, but also a process that benefits immensely from healthy and meaningful connections. Relationships based on empathy, understanding, and support can help a person find a sense of belonging and rebuild their identity in a more balanced way. Thus, overcoming addiction is not only about freeing yourself from the clutches of compulsion, but also about rediscovering a purpose and a connection with yourself, with others, and with something greater. In other words, overcoming addiction is not a journey that can be walked alone. The support of other people is indispensable to promote transformation and achieve complete healing. Jung believed that human beings develop within a complex network of relationships, personal, social, and collective, which profoundly shape the psyche. In the context of addiction, this means that the social environment, friendships, family, and even wider cultural structures have a direct impact on the healing process. Often, addiction stems from a state of emotional or social isolation, in which the individual disconnects from their community out of shame, fear of judgment, or the feeling that no one could understand them. For this reason, healing requires more than an internal change. It needs to be accompanied by social reintegration. Reconnecting with the community, with friends and family, and creating new support networks are fundamental steps on this journey. Healthy social relationships can offer a safe space of understanding, acceptance, and encouragement, crucial elements for the person to rebuild their life in a more balanced way. On the other hand, not all relationships are positive. It is essential that the individual distances themselves from people or environments that could feed the addiction or reinforce self-destructive patterns. The individuation process, as Jung defines it, includes a conscious choice of relationships and contexts that favor growth, recovery, and self-knowledge. In addition to the personal circle, social support can also be found in recovery programs, such as anonymous groups. These groups offer a welcoming space where people facing similar challenges share their experiences, difficulties, and victories. The act of listening and being listened to in a non-judgmental environment can have a profound healing impact, helping the individual to feel that they are not alone in their struggle. Jung understood that shared narratives and collective experiences create a sense of belonging, something essential to any healing process. These connections help to fill the spiritual void that is often the basis of addiction. In essence, addiction is a dysfunctional attempt to solve a problem that is, at its core, spiritual, a search for meaning, connection, and purpose. As Gabor Mate reflects in The Kingdom of Hungry Ghosts, not every story has a happy ending, but the discoveries of science, the teachings of the heart, and the revelations of the soul assure us that no human being is ever beyond redemption. This reminds us that no matter how deep the pain or addiction, there is always a possibility of healing, as long as the individual is willing to seek support and reconnect with the world around them.